idea of this session is to talk a little bit about getting competitive edge, but in a slightly different area. So on the one hand, when you have a new technology come along, like this, obviously one way to get an edge is by having a company that's better at doing it, using the technology more effectively, blah, 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 all that sort of thing. But there's also the issue of jurisdictional competitive edge. So what framework can we create in London, in the UK, I was going to say in Europe. That's an old habit, isn't it? So we'll drop the one. So what sort of framework can we create in London and in the UK? Well, let's look. What sort of framework can we create in London? I mean, basically stuff the rest of them. What sort of framework can we create in London that will give our companies an advantage in using this new technology? And that's not a framework about technology. That's a framework about ethics, governance. It's the other things that go around it. And if we can get that right, if we can make London a place where people want to come to set up these businesses because we have that better framework, that's a fantastic advantage to us. So we're going to spend the next half an hour talking about... Now, okay, all right, not everybody likes ethics. I accept this. You know, it's not a universally popular topic in finance, but we want to stick with it because we think we can make the world a better place. Okay. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of these guys just to tell you a little bit about their company, except Stuart, because we already heard about his. I'm going to get each of these guys to tell you a little bit about their company, because I want you to understand they're people that really know this business. These people aren't management consultants or whatever. These are people who actually know about this stuff, so they're going to tell you a little bit about this. And then I'm going to see if they can give us a few pointers as to how we should think about putting this kind of framework together. Right, so we're clear. Okay, so let's start down this end. Ruzbeh, please explain to people what it is you do. What? Oh, I don't know. No, they can't hear you at the back, I don't think.
So I'm Ruzbeh. I'm the founder of City Falcon. We leverage natural language processing and machine learning to make sense of financial content. So our target audience is anyone from someone in the stock market to someone tracking private companies to someone tracking, let's say, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So we've started with this, but now we're moving towards natural language generation and kind of real AI and not just machine learning.
So you read the newspapers for people.
Yeah, and where we're going is trying to get insights rather than,
right.
So instead of reading, you start analyzing
right.
and making decisions.
Okay.
And I actually like to code, so I actually do some of the stuff with the data scientists, though I'm not a data scientist and I'm not an expert.
This is like all newspapers? Or just the FT? And
No, so we focus on financial, economic, political newspapers. We cover Twitter. We look at filings. So we are actually getting more and more content. So if you're deciding to invest in a stock, instead of spending 2 days of researching it, you could do it in a couple of hours. That's the idea.
Let me just test it. So who in this audience, just put your hand up, who in this audience would invest in a stock because of something you saw on Twitter? Just put your hand up if you're... Oh, I don't think this is very fertile ground for you, Ruzbeh, but we'll try.
How many people do invest in the stock markets?
We'll try. Well, no, everybody invests in the stock market, but not because of Twitter. That's, I think you should stop reading Twitter. Stick to the FT. Dr. Shen, please.
Yeah. So I'm from Digits. It's the fintech and technology arm of JD.com, which is one of the largest e-commerce company in China and in the world. We have total staff of 180,000 in DG.
You have 180,000 staff?
Staff in DG.com, but for our company, fintech arm, and the technology arm, we have like 7,000 staff.
Oh, so it's just a little startup.
Yeah. So we are doing, So compared to a company in London, there's a smaller but more innovative company. In China, the scale is huge, right? So our client base is like 300 million people.
So what do you use AI for?
We use AI for example, the fintech business, like to do supply chain financing for companies and consumer loans for consumers. And also, but actually we use this technology expanded from fintech in the business to smart city. We have a unit of doing smart city to help the city governments to use the AI technology to manage the city. For example, the transportation, right? Okay. The credit. So, and then later we also expanded to AI-based farming industry, agriculture sector as well.
What do you do in farming?
Pig farms. The automated pig farms, to raise pigs.
What does the AI do?
AI, it's automated. So each pig, we have a pig face recognition. So we identify
Whoa,
each pig.
stop. No, you have to stop right there.
Okay,
Let's just put a pin in that, because just in case the people at the back didn't hear, they do pig face recognition. Now, this is because pigs they get up to criminal behavior in China, or what do you recognize the pigs
actually,
for?
this is this technology. We know that each pigs, their temperature, right? We measure and how much how much they eat per day. What's the condition, living conditions? Actually, much better than the traditional way of raising pigs. So we raise their living standard tremendously, but also we can prevent diseases from spreading. We can identify it quickly because
I just have to say, pigs to me, and but pigs look very similar to me. Don't they? I mean, really, how many pigs can you recognize?
In China, each year there's 700 million pigs will be out of these pig farms. 700 million. So actually, our accurate rate of recognizing each pig, the individual pig, is 99.5% or something. So actually, we are actually not only pigs. We also now have this cow face recognition.
I apologize.
There are all kinds of
because it is funny. I mean, it's a fantastic application, but it is funny. So you do cow face recognition as well?
Yes. So this
is like with Stuart. So if the cows are happy or sad, they get different treatment. Exactly, that's the kind of thing.
This is the Internet of Things, the next generation.
No, I know. I'm just already thinking about the API possibilities of connecting these things together. So, if you hear about a better application of technology today than face recognition for pigs, then I want to hear about it, because frankly, he told me that some of the pigs are bullies actually, and cutting down on pig bullying is a very significant application, right? See that. These people don't look far enough afield for their ideas, please. Do you do something interesting with pigs or something?
Definitely not.
I'm
the boring guy in the room. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm a founder of a startup in London. We work with banks and regulators to properly digitize documents rather than stock in the farm. But so we think that a lot of the document workflows at the moment is a bit broken. And it's just the cause of that is the tools that most people use in banks and in larger corporates. So we fully digitize the workflow of creating a document, and then we create a structured data set of everything that happens in the document. And then at the end, we use technology of machine learning and NLP to help people find answers much faster, and also see other content which is relevant or not relevant to them, to help them make better business decisions.
To accelerate workflow in practical.
Yeah, workflow and also finding the answers. So if you're sitting in the bank and then you're reading a policy and you have no idea why that policy or this procedure has been put in place, we can link it up into a specific regulation and show some insights why people who created that policy throughout the workflow in your organization had put it together.
And for those of you who weren't here first thing this morning, one of the things that Mark Carney said, he's the governor of the Bank of England, one of the things that Mark Carney said was that as part of the new financial infrastructure they were trying to build, the machine-readable regulation would be a fundamental part of that infrastructure. So they're going to set AI's, frankly, in my opinion, monumental task of trying to understand the existing PRA regulation and then turn it into some kind of machine-readable rule sets that these guys can then process and turn into workflows. So it sounds boring, but actually it's quite important. Stuart, do you want to just give a quick recap? You don't really need to, but...
Yeah,
so you're making robots that trick people into thinking they're sad or something. Well, I didn't get all of it.
Well, the key thing is really getting software to understand humans.
Right.
And once you can do that, you can start automating processes that wouldn't have normally been automated, or would feel very uncomfortable because they're one size fits all. Now you can start analyzing data and customizing. So
if I was
segmentation.
If I was using your, so let's say, I'm HR or something, and I use your software, and I say, don't send me any candidates that sound boring or depressed or stupid. It's that kind of thing.
Well, That's an interesting challenge. I think that as you start talking about that, we start getting into the ethics, which I think is into the meat of our conversation.
Damn, you've spotted my clever trick.
You almost slid it past me. What I would say is that approach is actually not very well scientifically founded. There's been a lot of research that's done. I don't know who here has ever done the Myers-Briggs. Do you know what your type is? And then have you done the Myers-Briggs 2 weeks later and found out that your type was something different? The conclusions that we make aren't necessarily accurate that way. What I would suggest is that the ethical way of doing it would be to look at your best performing employees, figure out what that je ne sais quoi that they have is, and then look at net new candidates and see if they're congruent, if they somehow match or are similar, and then hire on that basis.
Okay, but here's the reason why Stuart's idea is wrong. I just want to double check it with you, which is if you go to the bank and you look at all the highest performing employees now, they're a bunch of homogenous public school, dreary, pale white men, because that's who the bank hired 30 years ago to do it. So telling the AI to look for some more dreary, pale, publicly school educated, that's not really where we want to be, is it, Stuart?
No, I wouldn't say that, and I think
you just did say it.
No, what I suggested is that they had personalities that matched a certain type.
We don't want personalities. We want high-performing people. We don't want people with personality.
Well,
this is where you're going wrong.
Well, actually, so what I would argue is that personality distributes normally across the population. And as somebody with several degrees in organizational behavior, I can tell you that within organizations that's found to be true as well.
Okay.
And so what you're really looking for is the go-getter. And I think that if you went to, I think you call them public schools or high-end private schools, Eton, whatever it is, you would find that there is a distribution that would distribute regularly or normally across the spectrum of personality, just as if you went to somewhere else. We're involved in a study right now called Born in Bradford, which you may have heard about, where we're actually looking at the personalities of school students, young ages, like up to approximately grade 5, and sex as well. Sex, so gender, age, grade level, and marks. And hopefully what we'll discover is that personality is not a driver for any of those things, or maybe a driver for certain of those things.
But I just want to come back to this data set point because of what Stuart's talking about feeding in there. So I want to make one point about, I want to make one other point first. 700 million pigs, and you have a 99.5% recognition. That means there's 3.5 million pigs in China right now who are the victims of mistaken identity. And I just hope there's an ethical framework to help them reintegrate, is the point I'm making.
Well, I hope they don't go to the same ATM.
And they have bad personalities, many of these people. So, look, just feeding into the point that was made here, there's something here about the data sets, okay? So if I'm helping these guys to kind of navigate this ethical thing, say, I want my AI to operate in some kind of ethical framework, right? We all want that. That's not a controversial position. What that ethical framework might be is a controversial position. And how that, because if you just said to, I mean, we're picking on banks because this is a finance conference, but if you just said to banks, you can use AI, you know, to choose the best employees, the best customers and whatever, I'm not sure that's the ethical framework that we'd want. But before we come back to talking about the ethical framework, I want to talk about the data that goes into it. Because I don't see how you can teach your AI to behave properly unless you're feeding it the right data, surely. So where do you guys get your data from to start teaching your systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, what we've learned is, and again, I'm not a data scientist, is most of the time you're spending on, you know, aggregating content, kind of cleaning it out, making it relevant. Now, an example of this is, you know, I already get picked up for a lot of random checks at airports, right? Now, imagine if me, again, questioning that, and they'll be like, hey, it's the AI that decided, right? But the point is, what data did you feed for the AI to decide that I should be picked up for random checks, right? And if so, it's all brown-skinned people are likely to be terrorists, and then I'm going to be picked up there.
But are you making value judgments about the stuff? So let's sentiment example. So you read the newspapers and you see, are the newspapers saying some bad things about JD? Should we sell JD stock? because the newspapers are saying bad things about JD. Well, if the Financial Times says bad things about JD, that's not the same as if the Sun says bad things about JD, or if Hello Magazine says bad things about JD, right? So you must be making judgments about those data sets.
So what we do is we give you what the sentiment is, but then how you react is different. So I think the question, I think it's a stock market area, which is, did the news follow the price movement, or the price movement is going to happen after the news? So it's the relationship there. So FT might be just reporting what has already happened in the market.
Well, is that actually true? Do stock movements follow what's in the newspapers?
It's a complicated topic that I think.
I
a
know
lot
it
of
would be a
people-
complicated topic. But just broadly speaking, for the people in the audience,
Yeah.
should they care about what you're doing?
So I think
Because if the stock movements didn't follow the sentiment analysis, what would be the point of your business?
So I think it's depending on what you're doing in the market. So if you're doing trading, most of it is algo trading. So news comes out, you want that milliseconds advantage, you trade immediately. But for most of us who are investing for the long term, you're doing more research, that news is valuable input into your research. But doesn't mean I need to react immediately.
Right.
And that's the difference.
So basically, your bot is feeding other bots.
It could be
It's like
feeding other bots,
what
it could be, exactly.
What
Yeah.
people think is irrelevant.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
where-
I think there's a challenge here, and the challenge is actually described as the Netflix problem. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I assume everybody's familiar
yeah,
with
it's
Netflix.
you can watch videos on we've heard about this, Stuart.
Yeah, so the challenge really becomes, just to shorten it, that Netflix implemented an algorithm that actually analyzes what videos you watch, and then the keyframe that you see as the thumbnail of the movie, it provides you a thumbnail that it thinks that you will best appreciate. And so they had a challenge in the US where there's a lot of black people who watch movies that are, of course, or not necessarily of course, but are biased towards black audiences, which generally have black actors in them. And then it would show you a movie that was, the entire cast is white, except there's a black janitor in one scene, doesn't even have a speaking role, and ends up on the thumbnail. And this is an example of people getting very angry with the AI because they're saying it's acting unconscionably, it's racist, it's whatever. And the truth is the AI is working perfectly. What the humans didn't do is the humans didn't recognize that there's some fuzzy logic that needed to be applied.
Right, so where we're going with this is that the ethical framework isn't for the AI, it's for the people who... But can we come back to that point in a minute? Because you're sort of spoiling the ending of the talk. Because we want to build up this bit more. So let's just talk about data sets a bit more. So are cows harder to recognize than pigs? In the...
Actually, you know, this kind of, if technically, if you have more data, you will increase your accuracy ratio. Like face recognition, we also doing the call face, you know, for this Internet of Things, to build a modern, very, very just automated pig farms. So you need all the data, like, you know, the pig face recognition, then you get temperature of each pig very accurately, how much they eat, and then everything information. And then you can trace, and after even they go out, you know, so you can see their health condition. And if there's no swine flu, you know, this kind of diseases.
No, but I'm interested in the example because clearly the same kind of ethical frameworks that we would imagine that our jurisdiction, UK, London, should apply to doing this with people are not the same as the ethical frameworks around cows. So, for example, if you spot cows that are, I mean, I'm picking a silly example now, but if you spot cows that are, I don't know, lazy and overweight, you can shoot them and eat them, for example. Where you know, even post-Brexit, we'd still draw the line at this sort of thing. So the ethical frameworks are not the same. So what can we learn from these frameworks?
For example, we have this kind of consumer financing business, right? So consumer financing business. So actually the key issue is to identify the risks, right? This is how fintech is playing. The modern normal banks, they reject this loan application if you don't have collaterals, right? So a lot of people are out of this kind of possibility to get consumer loans.
Just as a general point before we come back to the governance, are AIs better at this than people are? I mean, I'm curious to know.
Yeah, of course. According to our practice, right? So we have data about people's shopping behavior in our website company. So we know that we can give this kind of get risk scores for each individual who want to apply for loans. So we don't require, like normal bank, like collateral, a lot of information you are providing. So we get all the information, then we can make a decision. I think the practice...
Where do you get that data from?
Data, the people are buying stuff.
So
in
you
our
feed
web
it from
page.
the e-commerce
Yes.
stuff.
So a lot of information we can get.
So there's no sort of GDPR or anything like that in China?
I think China is discussing, is debating.
You know I was going to joke with you.
Yeah.
Okay, so but we might have more of a problem accumulating those data sets, but we'd have to think of some other way of doing it. We'll have to set up a social network or something to get people to give us their data before we could do that kind of thing. So where do you get your data, and where are your data sets from?
Well, we usually get it from the workflow. So when people either put in comments around the document or around regulation, so we record all those insights, and then we're able to provide that insight back to the users.
So you're taking...
So it's mostly, and it's also sentiment. So
Right.
Sentiment behind
That's what I was
different
curious
paragraph,
about.
different clauses in regulation against internal document.
So the sentiment that you're feeding into it is coming from people, but surely that sentiment could have its own biases.
Yes, but it's the sentiment from the algorithm can also, people can learn from it, right? So it's an element of NLP which drives sentiment, but then it also goes into machine learning, and then people can learn from that as well. I mean, we've seen similar thing which happen in a structured data game, chess and DeepMind, of where initially the game learned the rules, which were fairly basic, example of Go and chess, and then it was vice versa. People started learning back from the DeepMind algorithm, and and became better chess players or Go players.
Well, that takes us into an area. Actually, can I come back to that in a minute? Because I want to ask a couple of questions. Because people are actually sending in proper questions. So I want to ask a couple of the questions first. So, so this is a general question to any of you. So can you identify ethical behavior traits, right, that are more likely to deliver socially preferable outcomes? In other words, the ethical framework we're constructing, is it kind of abstract, or is it built to deliver some social outcomes that we want, our biases? How do you imagine this being constructed?
Well, I think that there's a massive challenge, and the massive challenge there is that define ethics. And one of the challenges around that is, if you're familiar with prospect theory, I believe that there's a concept of prospect theory in ethics where your station in life actually can define what you consider ethical or not. So for example, I assume none of us would steal, but if our children were starving, we would steal a loaf of bread to feed them, and we would probably justify it. So as we start looking at
it depends what you mean by steal, I think. Because some of these people are investment bankers. So to be completely honest, Stuart, I think we should steer away from that for a moment. Well, but give me, see, because there are social outcomes. We want certain things inside. We want, inclusion and certain other
correct.
things. So somehow we have to set the frameworks up to deliver those, right?
Yes, and I think that what we have to do is we have to challenge ourselves in these circumstances and actually say to ourselves, is this the sort of behavior we would like in our society? So as you look in, for example, as a Canadian, we watch America very closely because it's kind of our doom if we behave incorrectly, and our savior if we behave
that
well.
That wall you're going to have to build is
exactly.
going to be bigger than the one in
Damn
Mexico.
expensive. It's long. But the challenge we see is that there's a breaking down of ethical rules where we've got, for example, Donald Trump saying that he's not going to obey laws. Well, the difference between a tyranny and a democracy is actually the willingness to obey the laws. So when Donald Trump says the policemen should rough up the people that they think are gang members as they're arresting them, that's what you would expect the Gestapo to do. And yet, the laws that say the policemen have to treat you as innocent before proven guilty are laws that we have in place. Even if we know the person's guilty, we should treat them that way. So when we start looking at it in the concept of AI, what we have to do is we actually have to test ourselves against it and start saying, is this behavior that could lead to antisocial or asocial behavior looking forward?
Okay. Just as a general rule, once conversations about ethics get to Nazis, I feel we need to pull back a little bit from that. I feel we may have missed some essential parts of the discussion first. Please, Andrey.
Yeah, about the ethnic rules. So actually, in China, the government is debating now whether they are going to introduce a data protection law, in line of the European, GDPR, So, but the issue is there's ethical rules, to guide this law, new law, right? But for China, the debate is whether they should follow the European law, which is very strict, whether there's too excessive protection of this data, which is different from the American standard, right? Then for
it
China,
will have its own cultural framework.
Exactly.
Around it.
So for China, it's, the debate is whether you want to have a similar law as the European standard, but actually will deter the development of the new company, innovative companies. There's the trade-off. There's a reason why European, there's very few, very successful AI, the mega AI company, right? It's emerging.
You're starting to tread on some toes here a little bit, I think. Look, nobody here is saying GDPR is a good thing, right? I assume. It's terrible, right? It was 8 billion euros down the drain last year. So nobody's going to sit here and defend GDPR. But we do have to have some kind of ethical framework, which brings me towards the next question, but I'm just curious. Sheep also look very similar to me. So would these same kind of algorithms work on sheep, or do you have to have different algorithms for the different?
Yeah, you have to alter, some parameters. I can tell you one thing about why, the pig face recognition rate is only 99.5, because once it's very, very accurate in recognize the white-skinned pigs, but then it's not so accurate in recognizing the dark-skinned pigs because not enough numbers. So the data is true. You have much more data feed into the system, and the accuracy ratio should increase, right? So the data, as I mentioned, it's very, very important.
I'm so sorry. I really didn't want you
But if you
to
look
be
at that,
exposed to racist pig face recognition. It's not what any of us wanted this morning. But thank you for your honesty.
one of the reasons that exists is that CCTV is tuned towards certain colors, just like Kodachrome film was. And it's actually better at recognizing lighter skin colors than darker skin colors. And this is a problem with facial recognition around the world. So now you start looking at it, and your comment about being a dark-skinned guy and going through the airport, our systems actually aren't as well tuned for that. And as a result, you can have all these false positives and issues around that. And so the argument is it more ethical to grab a larger data set so that you can do a better job?
We have to go. We have to go to one more proper question before we finish the session. So let me just ask, given that we all agree that having an ethical framework could be an element of jurisdictional competition, if we can construct the right ethical framework for AIs in financial services, we can make the UK a better, lower cost place to do business and be more effective and so on. But who should be regulating? Like, who says the ethic? I mean, is this like we go to the existing regulators, FCA, Bank of England? Do we need new kinds of regulators? Do we need new bodies? Do we let bots regulate the other bots and get us out the loop? I mean, give me your thoughts on who should be creating these regulations. Let's begin down this end.
So I just want to say to some of the earlier points also. One of the things I look for is look at science fiction and how many of them have happy endings. Right, most of them go into disaster. So that's the worry that a lot of us have.
Could you just pep it up a little bit for the people here? Because if every single discussion about AI is we are all going to lose our jobs or all going to die, which was the first presentation, people aren't going to feel like they've got their money's worth, really. So can you just give us a little more optimistic?
So I think that's going to be the next season of Black Mirror. They said it's going to be optimistic. So, but I think people are worrying about a lot of things, and it's just as society progresses, you will have these issues. You will have people, the climate change thing that is happening around London, the protests, and all those things will happen. In terms of regulation, I mean, there's obviously self-regulation because one is something which is legal, and then is ethical. So forcing something as, again, the definition of ethical is kind of up in the air depending on where you are.
But we have templates for ethical regulation, don't we? Like the Human Embryology Committee and this kind of thing. It's not like we've never tried ethical regulation before. It's just, I was about to say not in banking, but that's not quite what I meant. It's how do you see this regulation coming about? This is...
Yeah, judging from experiences in China or in Europe, I think definitely it's not the government or not the regulator who should set rules. You just look at the example of MiFID II, right? So the government introduced these regulations, which is, actually reduce or diminishing all this financial service.
I think one of the problems there, I mean, speaking quite seriously, one of the problems with that approach is that it doesn't have a cost-benefit analysis attached to it. So when you look at something, I mean, I'd pick a more neutral, if you look at something like AML4, AML5, the banks are spending, whatever it is, I can't even remember, 20 billion a year to comply with this in order to intercept, if I remember correctly, naught of the fraudulent flows. So because this is constructed with no cost-benefit analysis, I think the outcomes are inevitable. So I completely agree with you about this. Do you have any thoughts about where this regulation might come from?
Yes, it relates to banking sector in the UK. I think the regulators here are fairly innovative in a sense of adopting technology. I think as moving forward, I think FCA and Bank of England and insurance industry should be looking at making consultation a lot faster with the industry. And I think we can define the proper ethical framework of how we adopt technology in financial services.
And from your perspective, Stuart, what do you see happening?
I have a very different view of this. Perspective is everything, and I'm supposed to be an accountant back in the late 80s. And what I feel is that what should happen actually is there should be a requirement as part of the audit process, which would capture most of the larger and mid-sized companies, to actually put a statement in by the auditors that say that they've analyzed the use of AI and they answer that it's acting conscionably in whatever manner that ought to be for the industry. So for example, in banking, what that does is it puts an existential pressure on the board of directors of the corporation to self-police with the assistance of a large audit firm. And it actually would have a financial impact to the corporate health. And therefore, it allows the technology to evolve faster than the speed of government, which unfortunately government tends to be too slow. And at the same time would have a very meaningful outcome and would spawn an entire industry of discussion around AI audits.
Good suggestion. So just to finish up then, I'd suggest that the sort of 3 takeaway points from this session for you are that an ethical framework is an element of jurisdictional competition and therefore it's a priority. I think we've learned that the ethics have a lot to do with the ethics of the people and their selection of the data sets as much as they are about the algorithms. And I think we're also hearing that it may not be best left to government to come up with those frameworks, and perhaps some commercial pressures would help. Well, look, you had a panel that had actual experts on it. These are smart guys. They didn't know what questions I was going to ask them. They gave you their honest opinions. They weren't just reading some PR marketing stuff. I hope you appreciate that as much as I did. Please join me in thanking them.